Now, the purpose of the course is twofold. Number one is to help people who do not have a Lutheran background to understand better what Lutherans are. The second point is for people who have forgotten what Lutherans are, maybe we're confirmed or want to kind of just warm up things. So there's a lot of people that come to these classes for that reason. Okay, so my background is I was born and raised in Ohio. I went to Capital University, Capital in Columbus. Is that familiar? No? And then from the Capital, I walked across the street and went to the seminary in Columbus. Then I went to Germany and studied there for 3 years, came back, and it was the rule of the old American Lutheran Church, Ohio district, that I was planning on teaching at the time. And they said, if you want to teach either college level or seminary level, you've got to know what it is to be a pastor. So you were required to be a pastor. So I was sent to this little country church in Northwest Ohio, and I was there for 3 years, loved it, except I was, being a bachelor, I was, like in this 10-room parsonage all by myself. There were noises at night. I still don't know what they were. It took me a year to learn how to sleep. I'd been going to school for 11 years in colleges and universities and so forth where there were human sounds at night. I don't want to go into detail about what they were, but there were human sounds at night, and all of a sudden I was out in the middle of the country and they were just different sounds. Anyway, so then I got called to Grosse Pointe, Michigan, where I'd served as a vicar, and I served there for 10 years and taught world religions on the side at the community college. Then I went to California, and I was in Northern California in Castro Valley, which is in the East Bay area, and I was there for 10 years, during which time I taught church history at our seminary part-time in Berkeley. Then
Berkley?
Berkeley, and then I accepted a call to Florida at Venice because my mother had Alzheimer's and my sister was looking after her in Jacksonville. So I came here to get closer to my mother. Unfortunately, she died about 6 months later, but I saw her 6 times before she passed away. My father had preceded her in death. And then, after 9 years in Venice, I went to Arizona to help my godson raise his little boys, during which time I served as transition pastor for the synod for 16 years. Came back here because my sister's not doing very well in Jacksonville. She's still trying to recover from lymphoma, so that's why I'm back, and I moved back to Venice because I have friends and family, and that's my history. Okay, and then this is the syllabus for all 4 sessions. So tonight we're going to do session 1, obviously. The course that I wrote actually has 7 sessions, but Pastor Bobby only had time for 4, so we reduced it. And also I'm teaching the same class starting Sunday at the church that I rejoined, where I was the pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Venice, and that pastor only wanted 4 sessions. So you're missing session 1, which is about the history of the early church up till the time of the Reformation. Then the Reformation becomes session 1 here. And then the only other session that you're missing is the growth of Lutheranism in the United States. And then the last session, number 7, was always like maybe people wanted to do the Lutheran liturgy or questions always wanted to ask the pastor, but never had a chance to do it. Okay, I'm going to be able to go a little bit further, a little bit faster tonight, but I want to start with asking the question, the Reformation didn't just start overnight. Martin Luther didn't get up in the morning one day and say, "Oh, I got an idea. I think I'll start the Reformation." No, there was a history preceding that. What do you think are some of the historical events or developments occurred that made it possible for Martin Luther to be the first reformer to die a natural death, well, the second one, to die a natural death in his bed, because there were other early reformers.
Who was the first one?
Well, okay, early reform. Okay, we'll do that one. Early reformers. I was going to say
You said
the
he was
first.
the second.
The first one that died in his bed was John Wycliffe,
Oh,
but
Wycliffe.
he died in 1384, and he was at Oxford, and he was an early reformer. He had many of the same ideas that were picked up by Martin Luther, and he did die natural death in his bed, 1384. But in 1414, the bishops of the Council of Constance sent a committee to Oxford to dig him up and throw his bones and ashes into the Thames River, so that God would not be able to put him back together again on Judgment Day. So yes, he died a natural death, but he got spread around in the river.
Well, I think, to answer your question, I think one was the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yes,
Selling
yes.
of indulgences
Yeah.
and things like that.
If you
And
look
then-
around the room, you might see, tips.
Oh, oh, I didn't even see that corruption.
I thought you saw it, Dan. It happens to be the first one on the list.
But I thought the other was political.
Yeah, political,
conditions
economic
also,
reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, the corruption, the corruption we're talking about is the corruption in the papacy and the corruption of the church. Bishops and archbishops and cardinals and so forth were taking advantage of the people. They used the tactic of fear. You must do what the church tells you to do, or you will go to hell. And that's what they all said. And corruption, also a lack of learning. Many of the priests had no knowledge, or very little knowledge of the Bible. All they knew about were the rules and regulations.
They were
that
literate, though, right? They could read.
Some of them were barely literate.
Oh, really?
It was a really bad situation.
Really? Huh.
That's right. And Luther found that out in about 1530, after he'd been teaching in Wittenberg for a while. He decided, along with Pastor Bugenhagen, who was the pastor at the city church, and Melanchthon, decided to go out into the countryside and find out how much the people knew. And he found that not only the average person knew very little about the Christian faith, but also the pastors, or the priests rather, knew very little about the Christian faith. They just had rules and regulations. So what he did was he started writing posters that he wanted to put up in the churches, in the villages, and in the city halls, and in the city halls, the Rut House, and so forth. And he started out by printing up a poster on the Ten Commandments. He got those distributed. Then he did one on the Apostles' Creed. Then he did one on the Lord's Prayer, and so forth. And eventually all these posters were combined into the catechism, the small catechism, written about 1531. Now, I know this is a surprise to Charlie, but he doesn't know this, but I was able to get a hold of Charlie's catechism book.
I had to memorize.
Now, this is the
that.
one. This
I
is
had
the
to
one
memorize
in
it.
Deutsch.
No,
Or
in English.
But Charlie had to memorize it in German. And this is Charlie's small catechism. It's got his name in it, I think. And the date of it is 1933. Is that about, no, 1935. Is that about when you took
Before my
catechism?
time.
Oh, it was right after your time? Or
Before my time. Actually,
I have a copy of the original catechism, but I couldn't find it. I was going to bring it, but I did find this copy, and this is a copy that was written on the occasion of some anniversary, or copied rather, printed in 1935. Well, Hitler was coming to power at the time, and it says, herausgegeben im Auftrage des Allgemeine Evangelische Lutherische Kirche Schulvereins. The official Lutheran schools published this in 1935, and it has the old German print in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is not exactly the print that was used in Luther's day, when because one of the things you see on the board up there was the invention of the printing press.
When was that Gutenberg? When
About
was
50
it?
years before. And by the time, yeah.
50 years before
Before
Luther was
Luther.
born?
Before, no,
Oh.
no. About 50 years, maybe about the time Luther was born. No, a little bit before that, maybe 1470 or somewhere in there. And then Luther, of course, greatly benefited from the Gutenberg press, because about that time that he was ready to publish, and the press had been greatly advanced and greatly improved. And the etchings that they were able to do, which were the illustrations used in books in Luther's day, are pretty much just like the etchings that you see in this book. And I don't know if there's one in here, but at the time of Luther, there was a famous etching that showed Jesus sitting on top of the rainbow. And out of one ear came a large sword, and out of the other ear came a small lily. And the sword was much bigger than the lily, because in Luther's day, as he was being raised, the expectation was that the second coming was coming very soon. And Jesus was coming back, and boy was he mad. So he's portrayed as the one who's very angry, who's going to come back and judge, and about everyone is going to go to hell, is going to be sent to hell. That is the worldview that Luther possessed as a child.
Of course, people, they looked at the pictures. They
Charlie, you
couldn't-
want to see your
The
book?
common person just looked at the pictures, they couldn't read.
Absolutely,
Yeah, so
absolutely.
it was all in the-
That's
all in
absolutely
the
right, yeah.
pictures.
So anyway, so the corruption of the popes, Sixtus IV, and Alexander IV, and Paul II, and Pius II, and right up to the time of Pope Leo, who was Luther's pope at the time. He died, Leo died about 1521, 1522, and about the time that Luther went to the Diet of Worms, he died, and then the next pope took over. The pope preceding Leo was Julius II, but without going into great detail about who did what, the papacy was rife. These popes, Leo actually was not even ordained a priest.
Really?
Oh no, because it was a political position, and he was placed in that position by the Medici, the powerful Medici family, taken away from the Borgia, what the other family, the Borgia's family, and so forth. So it was political. So you didn't have to know anything to be the Pope. You just had to be in the right family with enough money, and so forth and so on. But in all fairness to the history of the papacy, Leo was the last pope who was not ordained into the priesthood. So things were starting to get better. Thanks to Martin Luther, they started to clean up the corruption, but they did not at the Council of Trent and so forth. After 1580, they started to clean up the corruption, but did not change the theology. But at least thanks to Luther, they did start to clean up the corruption. Nepotism, the selling of offices, the popes had mistresses, the popes had illegitimate children, the popes had hunting lodges, they would love to go hunting. Some of them liked to be warrior popes, they would lead their armies against whoever was trying to take over Italy, because the popes claimed that Italy belonged to them. And so, and then hedonistic. Pope Leo X, for example, lived a lavish life, and big meals and feasts and dancing and all kinds of stuff, that kind of stuff. He did like animals. His favorite animal was his pet Haro, the elephant, and he liked to ride on top of Haro. One day he liked to play tricks on people. So one time there was a cardinal who was kind of a dense kind of guy, and Pope would make fun of him. And he said, "I want you to ride on my elephant in the parade next Sunday or Saturday or whatever." And this cardinal said, "Fine." Well, the Pope chuckled because he knew the cardinal would have no idea what to do once he got on top of the elephant. And sure enough, he fell down off the elephant, and the elephant went crazy and trampled several people. But this is the story that things were not good in the realm of the papacy.
But then like they were selling.
Oh, we'll get into that. Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah, that's kind of. Hold on. Okay.
I thought that was part of the
No, it's got-
corruption.
well, it is, but I'm going to do it later. Go ahead.
Was there an additional Christian church?
No, there were attempts to have additional Christian churches, but they failed. In France, for example, there were also important movements started by people who did recognize the corruption, who spoke against it. So that would move us down to this point here, early reformers. And I've already mentioned one, John Wycliffe, who died in 1384. He believed that the Bible should be in the language of the people. He also spoke against the corruption of the papacy. He believed in the priesthood of all believers, just like Luther did. Later on, the idea was not new with Luther, but Wycliffe had talked about that. The fact that that priests are not special or better than other people by virtue of their ordination. We are all the same by virtue of our common baptism. I teach you which Luther taught. That was Wycliffe. He died in 1384. Another guy who learned about Wycliffe and who was the court chaplain in Prague was Jan Hus. And his followers were called the Hussites. I don't know if, Don, you're a Hussite. Can you tell me a little while ago you were a Hussite?
No.
Okay, anyway, we're a Moravian. They became known as the Moravians. And we have a relationship with the Moravians today. And they were the followers of Jan Hus. Now, Wycliffe died in his bed. He was regarded by many as a heretic, of course, many in church power, but he died in his bed. Jan Hus, however, was invited to leave Prague and to come to a gathering at Constance in Germany, in a council of bishops in 1414. And they said, Jan Hus said, well, I don't want to go. I might be dumb, but I'm not stupid. You guys are going to just nail me to a cross or whatever. Oh, no, come on down. We'll take care of you. We'll give you a safe conduct pass. They got him there. What did they do? They burned him at a stake. They did not hang him. They burned him at a stake. Okay. And then he was dead. He was dead. And if you go to Constance today, you can see where they burned him up on a hill there at the stake. So he taught me the same things also, that Wycliffe had taught, again, the priest of all believers, the gospel, the Bible should be in the vernacular, not in Latin or in Greek, but in the vernacular. And then he talked about the corruption of the papacy. Okay, so then the next important one was Savonarola, who lived after, or at the end of the 15th century, shortly before Luther was born, and he was a priest in Florence. Now, he was not so much into theology. His thing was to preach against the corruption of the papacy and the terrible morals and the indulgent life of the people who lived in Florence. The red-haired guy, fiery guy, he was really something to see and to behold. Now, he got in trouble with Alexander IV, who was the Pope, as you remember, of course, you know, was the Pope in Rome. And so Alexander IV sent a commission. He sent a committee to Florence to look into the matter. And they got there and they had a trial. But they said, we're not going to be like we did with Wycliffe or with Jan Hus. He said, we're going to give Savonarola, Father Savonarola, a proper hearing. It's going to be a fair trial. So they put out a bed of coals, you know, and they said, now we're going to give you a fair trial. If you are guilty, you will survive. If you're not guilty, you will burn up. Very fair, right?
Which
Yeah, right,
yeah.
yeah. So, and if you survive, of course, we'll hang you. Okay. So it's nice that they had a fair trial. Well, Savonarola didn't make it; he died too. Those are only three: Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and Savonarola. Now, getting back to Wycliffe, who died in 1384 in his bed at the Council of Constance in 1414, they decided that he had in fact been a heretic. They charged him with the same charges they levied against Jan Hus, and they said, we'll teach him. He may have died in bed. They sent a group to London, and they took his ashes and they threw them into the Thames River so that God would not be able to put them back together again on Judgment Day. That's what they did. So that's the story of the early reformers. That's enough of that. Okay, so along with the idea of the early reformers is the idea of humanism. Now, humanism, underline the word human, humanism was reaching a peak of interest because we're talking about the Renaissance during the time of Martin Luther, the end of the Middle Ages. And at that time, there was a movement that had gathered for speed or importance for a couple of hundred years called humanism. Now, humanism means that there was a renewal of interest in the Greek and Latin cultures, and the Roman cultures, and also the Hebrew cultures. So humanism was a rediscovery of the Bible in the original languages. Greek and Hebrew Old Testament, Greek New Testament, and Latin as well. Now, this idea of humanism also lifted up the importance of the individual. And that meant that peasant kids had a right to go to school and learn. Okay, so the emphasis was on the worth of the humans. And that prepared the way also for Martin Luther. The school that he went to at Erfurt was in fact a center of humanist teaching. Beale had been there. You don't remember his names, but a number of humanist professors had been there. So it was a rediscovery of the Bible because of the rediscovery of ancient languages. Now, if you were to go to Germany or anywhere in Europe today, and you would go to visit a palace, for example, that had been built in the 18th century, what would you see? You walk through the gardens, you would see Greek statues, Roman statues, and because of the Enlightenment, the idea that we want to get back to the Greek and Roman cultures, and also, as I mentioned before, a rediscovery of the Roman gods, of the pantheon, the Roman myths, the Roman stories, the Greek stories, the legends became important again. And so people in the days of Luther and moving on into the 16th and the 17th and 18th century, to be an intellectual person, an educated person, would be to know all about the legends of the Greeks and the Romans and the learning of the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, so why is that important? That's important because it began to change the worldview of people. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have the tension between scholasticism and am I writing wonderful? And nominalism. You don't have to remember that, but I'll tell you what it means. Scholasticism was the prevailing theology of the church almost up to the time, well, actually up to the time of Luther. Now, this prevailing stress of the scholastic means scholastic. I'm a scholar, so therefore I buy the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. It simply means that in scholasticism, the emphasis was on the idea of Thomas Aquinas that biblical truths are substantiated and echoed by the ancient philosophers, and like Aristotle and all those guys, okay? In other words, and it's still true to a large extent in the Roman Catholic Church today, if you would go to a Roman Catholic seminary, you would have to learn about the ancient scholars because what they taught matches what the Bible teaches. And that's called scholasticism. The humanists, and who then became the nominalists, said, absolutely not. No way, Jose. We have rediscovered the Bible. The Bible is an old moldy thing down in the cellar, chained to the floor. We brought it out to the light of day. And the important thing about Revelation is what the Bible says about God and Jesus and so forth. Forget logic and reason. No, there is not necessarily a correlation between the biblical truth and the philosophical truth. And those were called the nominalists because biblical truth is substantiated by philosophical truth only nominally. Nominally. Now, have you heard this before? All of you have been hearing this for years. Where do we learn about God and Jesus and what God did and what Jesus did and so forth? Where do we find that?
In the Bible.
It's in the Bible. Of course it's in the Bible. It's not in the writings of Aristotle or Cicero or any of those old duds, fogies back there. Absolutely not. So, now why is that important to the Reformation? Because, you see, the crack is starting. The official theology is being challenged by a new theology. And the official worldview is being challenged by a new worldview where people have worth. Not just the kings and the princes and the bishops and the archbishops, but any kid in any village has a right to learn. And Luther believed that strongly. That's why he wrote the Small Catechism. So you see these cracks, and people were upset about the corruption. The only people who weren't upset about corruption among the papacy were the people in Iceland, because they didn't know any better. But anyway, they never got the news. The printing press, Luther's ideas, widely disseminated. You know, just like CNN, whatever it's called. They wouldn't have television, but they had horses, and they had leaflets that could be printed right away. Of course, how many people could read those leaflets? Only 10%. But what did they do? They read them to others. The father would gather his children around, or the mother, or maybe Tante Tilly, or someone who could read, and would sit at the dinner table, the kitchen table, and they would read. Look what Martin Luther said today. Wow! Wow! Go for it, Dr. Luther! Go for it! Yay! Good for you! And corruption of papacy. The only one that I have left is the rise of the middle class. Oh shoot, I can't believe this. I spent way too much time on this. Middle class. Okay. We have a break. We have people challenging the official theology. We have people challenging the worldview. We have corruption. We have Martin Luther's stuff getting out there quick. We have what the early reformers people remember. Oh yeah, Jan Hus. Luther's saying what Jan Hus, I kind of remember him. Oh, Wycliffe, he's saying what Wycliffe. Oh yeah, and so forth. So we have all these things that are starting to change the worldview, change the opinions of people and their allegiance, their absolute allegiance to the church. And one of them, again, was no longer do you have the church on one hand and the rulers on the other hand, these two powers, always connected to one another. Sometimes the church ahead, sometimes the rulers ahead, then comes the church ahead, and all this friction. But they were maintaining kind of a balance of power, the church and the rulers. And all of a sudden, some of these people that were supposed to stay put, they started collecting money. Oh my goodness, we can't have these poor people collecting money because money is power. We can't have that. And one of them was the Fugger family in Germany, the Medici family in Italy. Of course, they were rich already, and other families, including Martin Luther's father, and others like Martin Luther's father. Martin Luther's father is from a small town called Mürre, which is near Stuttgart. And he was raised poor, but he lucked out. He went to a dance, and he met this lovely girl named Margarita. I'll show you how lovely she was. She's just a beautiful thing. Just a wonderful, beautiful girl. Yeah, there she is. He had such handsome parents. There they are. Margarita. Ah, yeah. Oh, aren't they handsome? Luckily, he met her because her family, luckily, her family had land and had built up some money in the bank and lived in the area of Eisenach, or Eisleben, where Luther was born, and lived there. So he married into money. He used her money to buy interest in a couple copper mines. And so that's why they moved. And she had to go down to Mora when she married him, but he moved back to get close to her family up at Eisleben, and she was pregnant, and a little boy was born in a house in a little town called Eisleben, which is close to Mansfeld, where he's raised. So now we're going to talk I'm going to give you details about Luther's life until we I run out of time, and then you can ask questions. But you're going to get the gist of it. So Luther was born, as you probably already know, 1483 on November 10. He was born in the little town of Eisleben. His father and wife, a couple of other kids, were on their way to Mansfeld because the interest in the mines that he bought was in Mansfeld. And there were three brother counts of Mansfeld, who owned these mines, but they were going to give, in return for Mr. Luther running the mining business, they were going to give him money. They're going to give him a part ownership, or he's part of the proceeds. So they're on the way. They don't make it to Mansfeld because Margarita, she's pregnant. She has to have a kid, so she has a kid. You can go there today and you can see the house where Luther was born. Okay, so then, because then they moved, about 6 months later, they finally moved on to Mansfeld. You can see the house in Mansfeld where they lived. And scholars until recently have said that Luther was born in a low middle class situation. But recently they dug up a hill, kind of a mound, near the Luther house and discovered it was a garbage mound. And it was the garbage mound where the Luther family threw their stuff, orange peelings, and they didn't have oranges, and stuff like that. And they found shards of pottery, and better than pottery. I don't think they had porcelain in those days, but guess what? In these shards, they discovered that Mrs. Luther, that lovely lady you saw, Margarita, had not one but two sets of china, one for every day and one for Sunday. And they took all this stuff and they put it in a museum. It's now across the street from the Luther house. And I didn't have time I was there a year ago in May. I didn't have time to see it. But so we're beginning to feel that Luther was not exactly a peasant, although he said, I was born a peasant. And then I was a monk, became a monk. Then I got into the Pope's hair. The Pope got into my hair. Ended up marrying a runaway nun. And he says, so what could you believe? How could anyone ever have imagined that by reading the stars? Luther was born. His father had the means to send him to a good school. First of all, in Magdeburg, where he learned Latin and music. Then he sent him to the school in Eisenach, where he learned some more stuff. And then finally, he was admitted to the University of Erfurt, which was the local university in 1501. And then he began to study theology, right?
I thought he had to be law, didn't he?
Law.
He gets an A.
Yeah.
He did not enter the school to study theology. He entered the school to study law. Why? Because his father, Hans Luther, said, you are going to go to this school, and you are going to learn the law, and you are going to be a lawyer, and you are going to take care of your mother and I in a fashion to which you are definitely going to be accustomed to. You understand what I'm telling you, boy? And so Luther had to go to school and learn the law. So after a while, he was called to Dr. Heinz. Professor Heinz was the leader of the law faculty, and he had to go to Dr. Heinz's study one day, and Dr. Heinz said, Martin, brother Martin, you are not doing so good in your law studies. Not so good at all. You got a little bit of a problem here. Yeah, you're at the bottom of the list. Yeah, you are Heinz 57. Yeah, Heinz 57.
There's only 56
get
in
it?
the class.
That's a ketchup. You don't remember that? Oh, yeah, okay, good. It's not Campbell's. Okay, so anyway, so Luther changed his mind, and of course, not because of that, but because he felt called to study religion. But in those days, you didn't just go to university and sign up as a person who wants to study religion. You had to be in the church. So he had, in order to study religion and the faith of the church, he had to become a monk. Well, you all know the story, what happened in 1505. He went home for summer vacation. came back, it was in July. He could see the walls and the towers of Erfurt in the distance. You can go there today and see the same thing. Churches are all still there. The monastery is still there. And he got caught in a violent thunderstorm. And the storm was so bad, the lightning and the storm was so bad, he got hit and he was knocked to the ground. At which point he said to pray to St. Anne. Why would he pray to St. Anne? Because she was the patron saint of miners, and his father was a miner. He came from a mining family. And he said to St. Anne, he said, St. Anne, he says, if you will let me live, I will become a monk. And St. Anne said, I don't care about that, but if you don't get out from under the tree, you'll be a friar. This is all true, of course. I've done extensive research in this. So he went off to Erfurt, better than the Heinz 57 joke, I can tell that. So he went off to Erfurt, and in those days, what you had to do, he had a last dinner down at the pub, beers and so forth, with his friends, and they were very sad. They said, don't do this. You will not like it. The monastic life is not a bed of roses. You know, we beg you, don't do this. He said, I'm going to do it. He went down, he went to the monastery, he knocked on the door, and that was, the tradition was you would knock solemnly on the door would creak open, and a monk inside would say, what do you want? He said, I want to give my life to Christ. I want to become a monk. Then you are ceremoniously entered, and you had a year of internship, so to speak. And so then he was consecrated a monk a year later, and after being a novice for a year. And then a year later, in 1507, very fast, he was ordained a priest. But he was ordained a priest as a monk in the Augustinian monastery. At that time, there were 5 or 6 monasteries. Why did Luther pick the Augustinian monastery? Because we think it was the strictest. And I think he was looking for, what I don't think, we know from his writings, he was looking for a way to make himself presentable to God, righteous before God. In those days, what you did, as better than, unless you had a lot of money, which you gave to the church, or went to see the holy relics, or went on a pilgrimage to Rome, or whatever, gave a lot of money to the archbishop or whatever to build a church. The only chance to be righteous before God and to be saved was to get involved as a monk. Then, of course, after that, better would be to be a priest. And after that better would be to be a bishop. And the best would be Leo X. And if you didn't believe it, just ask Leo. He'd tell you, I'm saved. You know. And so he became a monk and then was ordained a year later. Now, how could he be trained so quickly to become a priest? In those days, you were trained, you weren't trained very much, but you were ordained into the priesthood before you learned what you had to do as a priest, which wasn't much. But anyway, so he became a priest. Very conscientious, very sincere person, someone who wrestled, he called it meine Anfechtung, who wrestled with his standing before God. Anfechtung. Boy, this is so hard to write with this. It's not my writing, of course, it's the chalk's part. So then he constantly worried about his salvation. It just so happened that the vicar general at the time was Dr. Staupitz, who was the abbot of the monastery. Now there's a story that I've done a lot of research on this, and his best friend in the monastery was Brother John, or Johann, Brother Johann. And there was an incident that's recorded, it's hard to find, but I found it, that they had delivered wine on one occasion, and it was down in the cellar of the monastery. And the next morning,
you had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. You couldn't go to bed till 12, but you had to get up for the first matins at 3 in the morning. And so they were there, and Dr. Staupitz was there to open the devotions, you know. And so he intoned, of course, he said, Im Namen des Vaters und des Sohnes und des Heiligen Geistes, Guten Morgen, good morning. And all the monks responded, good morning, except one monk said, good evening. So who said that? Just stopped and looked around. Let's try it again. Im Namen des Vaters und des Sohnes und des Heiligen Geistes, good morning. They spoke a little English. And all the monks said, good morning, except one said, good evening. At which point Dr. Staupitz chanted, some monk chanted evening. This is true, isn't it?
I saw that on Facebook.
No, write that down. Okay, so Luther then was a very bright young man, but greatly troubled about his favor before God. And so what did he do? He did what you were supposed to do. If he ate less than the other monks. He worked longer than the other monks. He prayed longer than the other monks. He went up to his room on occasion and beat himself with a stick. Sounds terrible, but that's the way it was back in those days. And so finally then he would do confession. And he would go on and on and on. And Dr. Staupitz said, Brother Martin, he said, you don't have to confess every little bitty sin. I don't care if you didn't eat the apple core. Brother Martin, calm down now. God is not that way. Staupitz was ahead of his time. He was a humanist, of course. He began to understand that we need to take another look at God, what we preach to be God. God was introduced. If you would look at a etching in those days, you would see one of them would be a rainbow with Jesus sitting on the top with a sword coming out of one ear, a little bitty lily coming out of the other ear. The lily was not big, but the sword was big. He was coming again to judge the living and the dead. And the people believed that he was coming soon. There was a widespread feeling among the people that Christ was coming soon. And you were afraid because this Jesus was coming, not to pardon you, but to put you in hell forever. So Martin Luther was part of that understanding of the church, the teachings of the church. So finally then, Staupitz said, Brother Martin, he said, you are taking all this too seriously. Of course, you have to do good works to make yourself acceptable to God, and to make yourself righteous, but you're taking it too far. And he says, by the way, he says, you need a little vacation. So he said, I need someone to go down to Rome. I've got two groups of monasteries under my care. One wants to stick by the old rules and reform the church according to the old rules, and the other group, they're getting a little bit loosey-goosey. I want to combine them into one group so that I can control all of them. And I want you to go down to Rome and ask the head of the Augustine order for permission to do this. And I says, you have to pick someone to go with you. And he said, well, I'll take Brother John. He said, well, Brother John, we heard about him. He got in trouble because he was saying good evening instead of good morning. And I told him, I said, you're going to have to wear hard peas in your sandals for that. It's your penance. And Luther said, yeah, I know. I wore the peas for a week, and they hurt. Those hard peas really hurt. He said, what happened to Brother John? Well, Brother John said they didn't hurt at all. Why not? Well, Brother John said he cooked them, so that's what went wrong. So anyway, so Luther goes down with Brother John, and he go down. Now, it took about 6 weeks or so to get there. It's a long trip, of course, and they stayed in Augustinian monasteries along the way. They got down there. Now, people think Luther was there a long time, but he wasn't. He was only there a couple weeks. But during these couple weeks, some things impressed him. One was how dirty the Tiber River was, because people were throwing their garbage into the Tiber River. The other thing was there were big expanses of land with nothing on them, just weeds, except a broken statue there and a broken statue there and part of an old Greek, Latin, Roman statue there and so forth. But the Pope was living high in the hog. He had hired Michelangelo and to do the Sistine Chapel and all this kind of stuff. And so there were, Luther was so negatively impressed by the life of Riley that the higher-ups lived. Another thing was that he had been given instructions to say a funeral mass for a number of people, including his grandfather, and to help get his grandfather out of purgatory into heaven. And he would go into one of the side altars. If you've been in Europe, these big churches have side altars. Those are so that priests can do funeral masses for people, and they get paid for it, of course. So Luther went in and went up to a side altar and started his mass. Gone through with it. The priest over there was already done. They were saying the mass like in 10 minutes, just to get more money. The more masses they said at the private masses, the more money they got. So Luther saw a lot of the corruption. He saw how the cardinals and the archbishops lived high on the hog, and the Pope, and never met the Pope. He never met the Pope. He had to ask permission of the head of the Augustinian order. I met him, the head, not the one that lived in Luther's day. I was invited to lunch when I was in Rome once to eat with the Augustinians, because they said, well, we're closet Lutherans, so come and have lunch with me. That's a true story. That's one thing that's true. And I did. But just before that, I was robbed by gypsies who took my wallet. But so, an interesting day. So Luther went back to Germany to give his report. Now, the head of the Augustinian order said that it would be okay for Staupitz to combine those monasteries under one rule, that he would determine what the rule was. Luther at that point did not agree, but he reported back to Staupitz anyway, and so it happened. Staupitz then became the leader of more monasteries, so he was trying to reform the monasteries. They were very strict, but he wanted to make them stricter. Well, obviously the one that Luther went to was one of the strict monasteries. Okay, so then Staupitz suggested that since Luther was a bright young man, that he teach at the university, but not the University of Erfurt. There was a new university that had just been founded by a prince whose name was Frederick the Wise, in the town of Wittenberg, which was not much of a town at that time. It was kind of a mud hole, but the prince had built a palace for himself there, and he had troops harbored there as well. Now, it just so happened that Frederick the Wise had just had a split in the family. His grandfather, who was Duke George in Dresden, had two sons. One was Ernest and one was Albert. And the sons fought with one another. So the father said, okay, Albert, you are going to be the Duke of Dresden. But I'm going to give land to Ernest, who will be the Duke at Torgau. So Ernest, you'll have to go and build yourself a castle there, because now you're going to be... So he split the Saxon princedom into two parts. And so that's how we have Duke George the Bearded, as you probably remember, who was the Duke in Dresden, who remained staunchly Catholic. But we have his cousin, Duke Frederick the Wise, who is now the Duke, or the Prince, he had the title of Prince, at Torgau, who also wanted to establish a new university at Wittenberg and also have a castle there, along with barracks for his military. So that's why there was a new university. He couldn't send Luther to Dresden, because Duke George the Bearded would, he was very pro-Catholic. And so Staupitz, I think, had an idea here that a better place would be to go to Wittenberg, which was, of course, closer, by the way. That played a big part of it. So Luther went off, left Erfurt, went to Wittenberg, and he taught philosophy, and he taught the Psalms. He began to teach the books of Paul. Then he came back for a while to Erfurt. His fellow students were angry with him because he was Mr. High and Mighty. He was now a professor at Wittenberg, and they weren't. You know, how come he got to go, but we didn't, you know, that kind of stuff. There was some friction going on. He stayed at Erfurt for a while. And then eventually he went back to Wittenberg, did get his doctor's degree. You had to pay a sum of money, basically, and that's how you got your doctor's degree. But you also had to be smart. And so he did get his doctor's degree. And he began to teach at Wittenberg. Okay, so he's teaching at Wittenberg, and he begins to discover a new insight about the nature of God, as he reads especially Paul. If we were to open up one of those Bibles and read Romans 1, verse 17, for example, we would see that it says, no one is saved by good works, lest anyone should boast, but is saved through faith. You're justified through faith, not works, lest anyone should boast. Wait a minute, I've been worried about making myself acceptable to God all these years. And now Paul is saying here that I have nothing to do with my salvation. It is God's gift. And that you don't earn salvation through works, but you reflect faith in God by doing works. Works that are expression of your gratitude for your salvation won for us to Christ. So he started teaching that. And then he decided to have a debate with another professor on this issue here, scholasticism versus nominalism. And so he posted on the church door at Wittenberg an invitation to any professor, one of his colleagues, who'd be willing to debate scholasticism versus nominalism. Well, man, they just lined up to get involved in that debate. No, they didn't. Nobody came. Nobody. So he said, well, he says, there's something else going on here. He heard about Archbishop Albrecht, not too far away in Magdeburg. Now, Archbishop Albrecht also became Archbishop bishop at the age of 16. He became Archbishop at the age of 17. And of course, he knew a lot about the Bible and so forth. Anyway, so he's Archbishop, and he decides, you know what? I would like to have more power, because I'm on my way up. I'm a young guy. I'm on my way up here, and I'm going to go see. I'm going to get some money together, and I'm going to go send my brother John down to Rome to talk to the Pope, to see if I could get the archbishopric of Mainz in addition to the archbishopric of Magdeburg. Why did he want the archbishopric? Why did he want to be archbishop of? Not because he wanted to be archbishop of two archdioceses. There was a reason he wanted to be the archbishop of Mainz on the Rhine River. Why? Because the Archbishop of Mainz was an elector. And there's only 7 electors. And their job is to elect the Kaiser, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German Reich, when there's a vacancy. And it appeared Maximilian was getting older, there might be a vacancy. I would love to have that power. So he sends his brother John down there to Rome. And John goes in, and the Pope's having lunch. The Pope says, come on. How about some ravioli, or some spaghetti, or some wine, vino? Well, come on, brother John, come on. Brother, I am not here to eat ravioli, but I'm sure it's very good, your Eminence, your Holiness. But I am here to ask you a question. What is the question? He was Italian, of course, and John says, well, he says, my brother, he would like to be the Archbishop of Mainz in addition to the Archbishop of Magdeburg. That was wrong. You couldn't do that. You can't do that in the church today, at least officially. You can't be the Archbishop of two places, involved in all this corruption. Sixtus IV, Paulus II, Julius II, Alexander IV, all these popes, they were just selling offices. Well, how much money you got? I'll let you be the abbot over to the local monastery. How much money you got? You can be the bishop over here. It's a nice church. You'll like it or not. And boy, oh boy, they got a nice palace that goes along with it. Oh, nepotism was rampant in the church. So, of course, the Pope wasn't shocked to have this question presented to him. And he said, it would be nice if you could make a donation to build the St. Peter's Basilica. We want to build up the church here, the big new church, St. Peter's Basilica. And John says, well, we're prepared to do that. He says, we thought 7,000 ducats. A ducat was worth about $120 a piece. So he said 7,000 ducats for the 7 deadly sins. The Pope says, no, I was thinking more along the lines of maybe the 12,000 ducats for the 12 apostles. Then John says, well, no, how about 10,000 ducats for the 10 Commandments? You got a deal. He shook the hand. There was a problem. Albrecht did not have the money. So what's he going to do? The Pope's going to accept 10,000 ducats in order to make him the Archbishop of Mainz. He didn't have the money. What do you do when you need money? You go to the bank. So he goes to the Fugger Bank down there in Augsburg, and he gets the loan. The Pope says, well, you're going to have to pay the money back. So here's what we're going to do. He says, you give me half of the money you get from the Fugger Bank, and then I'm going to let you sell indulgences. You give me half of that money, and then, of course, hopefully you'll have enough money left to pay off your debt. So the deal is struck. Luther hears about it, says, this is not good. This is not good. No, sirree, we can't have the Pope giving grace away. So Luther goes into a tiny German that he is, and has a few beers, tries to calm down, and he writes the 95 Theses, and he nails them to the church door. And there they are in Latin, nailed here. Now this church door has burned. There have been a few wars along the way. So what they did, they replaced the church door with bronze, and they engraved the original 95 Theses into the church door. You can go there and see it. Yeah, and so he attacks the indulgence system. He says, first of all, he says there is no excess grace. The church was teaching, well, Mary was such a good person, she has excess grace. Peter was so good, pretty good, he has excess grace. This person. And so it's like to have all these saints with all their excess grace. They did more than they needed to do to get into heaven. So the excess stuff goes into a trunk that the Pope had in his bedroom. And so then, for a little donation, he could open the trunk and dispense a little bit of excess grace. And he's got a big legal paper, that with his stamp on it. And so Albrecht had to get someone that was a good salesman. So he got Tesch to come, this Dominican priest who wore a Dominican habit, of course, and he's coming into town, and he's Tetzel, his name. He's coming into town. He's got band. He's got flags. He's got trumpets. He's got horses. Come on! Gets up on an orange crate down at the middle of town. And he says, come get him while they last. Come get him while they last. Special deal. You don't have much money? Well, yours doesn't cost that much. You have more money? Yours costs more. And he's selling this stuff across the river from Wittenberg. So naturally, some of the folks in Wittenberg hear about it. Oh, wow, I can get a dispensation. I can get 10,000 years out of purgatory. Now, you could only get a dispensation out of purgatory because the church taught that they had no authority. The church had no authority to get someone out of hell. If you go to hell, you're too bad for you. But if you just get to purgatory, you have to spend some time to make yourself righteous before God. We can give you 10,000 years out of purgatory, or 20,000, whatever you want. Just sign, give me the money, And so when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And this was Johannes Tetzel was selling that stuff. Luther gets all upset, and then he writes his 95 Theses, and he gets in trouble with the Pope, and things snowballs. He didn't intend to do that. And then he goes off and has a meeting with the monks in Heidelberg of his Augustine order. Many of them agree and go back to southern Germany to also begin to lead in the Reformation. He has a famous debate with Johannes Eck, who was a professor at Leipzig. And Johannes Eck says, the things you're saying are what Johann Hus said, so you are also a heretic. So Luther is now officially proclaimed to be a heretic. Then the Pope hears about it, sends a guy named Miltitz, who was a member of the lower court, down to Wittenberg to tell Frederick the Wise, Luther's prince. He says, I got something special for you. Well, what do you got for me? He said, well, look right here. Here's the golden rose. It's the golden rose. The rose is the golden rose of valor. And it's yours. It's yours. Frederick goes, I know what he's up to. He says, oh, by the way, well, we're giving you the golden rose, the big honor, the Emmy for this year. He says, maybe you could send Luther down to Rome to get tried, or at least exile him so we can get our hands on him. Frederick, he's wise. Frederick the Wise. He knows what's going on. He's not going to be beholden to the Pope. So he accepts the golden rose, but he says, I'm not going to do what they want me to do. And so then Luther begins feverishly to write because of the accusations, the thing that's going around. And he writes to the Christian nobility and says, he says, we need to watch out. The Pope has got too much power. The Pope claims he has 3 walls around him. He has authority over the Scriptures, as if he knew something about the Scriptures, to determine what the Scriptures say. He claims to have authority over the bishops. Well, we tried to get the power back into the bishops at the Council of Constance. That didn't work. It's now back in the Pope again. And he claims he has the power over the rulers. Well, none of this is true. So what does he do? What happens? The rulers, the dukes, and the counts, and the no-counts, and the princes and the kings, I said, boy, this guy's got a head on his shoulders. He says, we don't have to be beholden to the Pope. He says, the Pope doesn't have that power over us. And he gets a lot of support. Then he writes the Babylonian captivity, which is what we'll talk about next week, 2 weeks from today, which is about the sacrament of the altar. The Pope is misusing it. He's chaining people to a Babylonian captivity by claiming if you don't go to Mass, you're going to go to hell. Well, which one are you going to take? So to this day, many Catholics, of course, are very interested in going to Mass, but I think more today for the right reasons. And then he says there's only 2 sacraments, not 7. We'll talk about that. And so he gets that off, and it's called the Babylonian captivity. His popularity is rising. And then he writes The Freedom of the Christian Person. And Miltitz, who's this lower rank guy that sent Rome to try to get Frederick the Wise to do the Pope's business, but the Pope wants. Miltitz said to Luther, he says, now, Dr. Luther, now you may think that you're in trouble with the Pope, but you know what? All is not lost. Now when you write that, the bondage of the will, which is about we are free from bondage, we're not enslaved anymore. Freedom, we have the right. God gives to us the right to accept Christ. That's what it's all about. So he says, it's Luther's most famous writing, and they say it's his best writing. So he says, Miltitz says, now when you write that, send a copy down to the Pope, and I've got a horse out there ready, and you write a letter, a cover letter. It says, Dear Your Holiness, or whatever you call him, Your Holiness, right? Whatever, Your Eminence, whatever. He says, Dear Pope, he says, I'm sending you a special copy of my latest treatise called The Freedom of the Will. And I just want you to have this special copy, just for you. See, I've got it signed, just for you. And I'll tell you what, I know you're going to like it, and I know you're going to want to help me bring in the Reformation. In fact, what I'm suggesting you do is to give up the papacy and go to some little nice village and live a nice, lovely life as a priest in a little village for the rest of your life, and help me with the Reformation. The Pope did not accept Luther. The letter was sent, but the Pope did not accept Luther's explanation. Instead, he was ordered to go to the Diet of Worms in 1521. And there he was interrogated by the Diet. The Roman cardinals and the leaders who were there wanted to arrest him and burn him at the stake, but they were outnumbered because there were thousands upon thousands. I mean thousands. We're talking 1521. Still, thousands of people who had come to Worms to give their support for Luther. The hall where the interrogation was held was very small, but the people were gathered around trying to get in through the windows and listen. It was very hot. It was a very hot day in April of 1521. Luther, to make a long story short, he said, yes, these are my writings, but these writings are not contrary to the teachings of the church. These writings, well, they're depending on how you read them, These writings certainly are contrary to the teachings of the church. Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders, Gott helfe mir, Amen. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. God help me, Amen. Now Luther's in trouble. Frederick the Wise, who is there, it was the only time Frederick the Wise ever actually had a conversation with Luther, by the way, even though they lived in the same town back in Wittenberg. Because Frederick Wise would be able to say honestly all the time, I don't know much about this guy. I hardly ever see him. I never talked to him, in order to, he was backing Luther, so to speak. Frederick the Wise talks to Charles V. The emperor says, I want to have that boy, I want to have that young monk, I want to have him burned. Well, you know how old Frederick the Wise was? He's 21 years old. That's another story. We don't have time. So anyway, that's a good story though. But anyway, so he lets Luther go back to Wittenberg and wants to grab him along the way. But as you know, now you know all this, you've seen the movie, right? Luther gets across the border into Saxony, and a bunch of KKK guys with hoods come and they grab him and they take him off to the Wartburg Castle, which was owned by Frederick the Wise, but was uninhabited at the time. And so Luther hangs out there for 10 months, disguised as Junker George or Knight George, and then finally goes back to Wittenberg, and then he introduces the Reformation. Now, just quickly then, we can sum all this up. Here are the three teachings of Luther, and became the three teachings of the Protestant Church. Is by Scripture alone, means only Scripture has the authority to teach us about God and Jesus Christ. Not tradition, not hearsay, not any pronouncements of the Pope, even if he does speak ex cathedra, that's another story, but only Scripture. Not reason, not logic, not philosophers, Scripture alone is the way that we know about God, who God is, what God has done, and who Christ is, and what Christ has done for us. Only Scripture. Nothing outside. Tell that to the Mormons. Go tell them. Say, the Book of Mormon? Sola Scriptura, read my lips. Only Scripture, not the Book of Mormon. In addition to Scripture. I'm just using it as an example, trying to make it relevant. Okay, so then, or not what you think you know about Jesus, or what you dream up, like some of these cult leaders that have these revelations about Jesus and have new teachings, so they gather a cult. Okay, sola fide means by faith alone, not through good works. You do not earn your way into heaven. You trust the promises of God. It's called faith. I did a wedding in Arizona last Saturday, and I stressed that to the married couple, that as you trust God in your faith for God to keep His promises, so do you trust one another. Our faith in God is a model for the married life. The husband and the wife trust each other. Now, we like it to be that way, but at least we aim for it. I had a marriage counseling thing, and I got to this point, and I said, do you trust each other? And the future wife was going, I could tell she wanted to say something, she was afraid. I said, what do you, I see you're kind of hedging here, what's going on? She says, well, I trust Randy. I trust Randy, but well, sometimes he goes off to work, and I don't know whether I should trust him or not. And I said, well, why? And Randy spoke up, because I'm a male stripper, and I told her she could come along. So the married couple has to have trust. So trust in God, sola fide, through faith, through trust in God. Only faith, not works, only faith that we accept what Christ says. And sola gratia, sola gratia, by grace alone. Another emphasis on you don't do good things to get crown or jewels in your crown, but God freely, through grace, God loves you and accepts you and reserves the kingdom for you. So that's it. I got through most of it, so. There are a lot of things I could have added, but I didn't have time. Any questions? Now, those of you who want to leave, because the hour's up, I'm not going to make you stay. Watch out, he's going to leave. Write that name down. He's leaving. I can't believe he's leaving.
Did Luther actually use the words Reformation?
Yeah.
Is that something we've...
Reformation. Reformation
I
in
didn't
German.
realize that.
Uh-huh.
So he saw himself as a reformer.
You know what? Yes, he did, but he didn't use the word Reformation. He used the word evangelisch. When someone had to put a name on the ways in which he wanted to change the church. And as you know, Luther did not want to pull out of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
He wanted to reform the church. That's where he used the word reform. But people said, okay, we're a follower of Luther, so that makes us Lutherans. And Luther said, no. He said, evangelisch, which in English is translated Protestant. So he preferred, so that's why many of our churches have, I don't know about this church, but Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church,
Yes.
St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church, Emmanuel Evangelical Lutheran Church. Evangelical, not the way it's used by the evangelicals today. Right. They use it as a movement, as a separate movement, which is not mainline. But if you go to Germany, you'll be asked if people want to know what you are. Say, sind Sie evangelisch or sind Sie katholisch? Are you Protestant or are you Catholic? So Luther preferred the word, the movement he preferred to call it the evangelical movement, related to the gospel. Evangel, the Greek word for gospel. Okay, anybody else?
The Dutch Reformed Church that came out of the Reformation?
The Dutch Reformed Church, after even during the time of Luther, there were scholars who were, of course, were all Catholic, but were coming to Wittenberg to learn from Luther. And eventually then the Reformation got to the Netherlands, and but alongside of Luther, maybe half a generation behind, was a similar movement known as the Reformed movement. And the Reformed movement was initiated by some of those priests who heard Luther at that discussion in Heidelberg in 1517, and went back to southern Germany and Switzerland and France. And along came half a generation later, of course, was John Calvin. John Calvin taught more of a reformed version of the Lutheran Church, which was more conservative, meaning anything that was Catholic was, you couldn't have statues or beautiful windows or anything, and the focus would be on the sermon and not on the sermon and the sacrament. So the sacrament became more, we'll talk about that next 2 weeks from today. The sacrament became more symbolic. Anyway, so the Dutch church became a Reformed church. Some of the churches in southern Germany, like in where I went to school, in Baden-Württemberg became Reformed. I was a Reformed pastor for a while. I didn't know it, and I didn't tell you about it. It was kind of a secret. But you know, for example, well, I'll tell you more about that when you come 2 weeks from today. I'm getting off track here. So anyway, so the
Ray,
Dutch
you gotta
came.
be here,
The
Ray.
Dutch decided to follow the teachings of John Calvin. So they became the Reformed Dutch Church, and the Scots became the Reformed Scottish Church, also Presbyterian Church, because they recognized the authority of the church would be exercised by presbyters,
Yeah, I grew up
or
Dutch-
elders.
yeah, I grew up Dutch
So
Reformed.
anything, the German Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Slovak Reformed Church, or the Presbyterian Church, anytime you see the word Reform, means they follow Calvin instead of Luther. And the big problem with that, we'll discuss 2 weeks from today. Next week, we're going to do baptism. Okay, any more questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, Don?
Why were after Luther came, the monasteries broke up, the nunneries broke up?
Yes.
Why?
They broke up because they felt they were part of a Catholic system, and so they didn't want to be Catholics. They didn't want to be beholden to the Church of Rome. So many of the monks became pastors, and now, as you know, that movement did not die out 100%. We've had deaconesses in the Lutheran Church and so forth and so on. But essentially, the monastery, for example, in Wittenberg, was called the Black Monastery because the monks wore black, not because it was dirty, although it is kind of black, but kind of worn looking, but because the monks were there. So what happened? They decided to leave monkery and nuns behind, and it was a way of expressing that you were getting off the Catholic wagon and getting on the Luther's wagon, and the idea that being a monk or a nun doesn't get you anywhere anyway. You don't have to be a monk or a nun. You can be a lay person, you're a candlestick maker, or whatever, or you can become a pastor now. So many of the monks became pastors, and then adopted the idea. And in the meantime, the Black Monastery became Luther's home, not part of it. If you go there, he was given a quite extensive set of rooms. I forgot to mention Katerina von Bora. He married Katerina. Yeah, 1 hour isn't enough time to do this.
How could you forget that?
Well, next week, if there's anything you think of, we'll talk about it before we talk about baptism. Unless you have any more questions now?
Where's that door today? Because I know I took pictures of it when I was in Germany.
This door is in the castle chapel of the castle of Frederick the Great. Now, most of the castle is gone. We're starting to restore part of it. But the castle was attached to this chapel. And if you go to Wittenberg, it's big, tall towers and so forth. So the door is the door to the Schlosskirche, they call it, the castle church, Schlosskirche. And then there's another church more downtown at the village, or at the town square. It's called the People's Church, or the Stadtkirche, which means the city church. Luther mostly preached in the city church, and the fellow who took it over as the pastor was Bugenhagen. Get back to the question he asked, Darnie's left the room. But as you know, the Reformation quickly spread in the north, Luther, in the south, Reformed Church. But in the north, for example, Sweden sent a monk by the name of Olaus Petri, who came to Wittenberg, studied with Luther, went back and introduced, with the help of the king, the Lutheran Reformation in Sweden. The Danish church sent a guy named Hans Tausen, who took the Reformation back, and Christian III, the king of Denmark, met Luther at the Diet of Worms. And so he along with Hans Tausen, introduced the Reformation in Denmark. In Iceland,
They, as I said, they were pro-Catholic a long time. It took a long time for the news to get there, but they eventually became Lutheran as well. Oh, Finland. Finland sent, the king of Finland sent a guy named Agricola, who came and studied under Luther and went back. So all those Scandinavian countries quickly, swiftly became Lutheran. Now, it's not a coincidence geographically. Where are they compared to France, for example, or Italy? They're far away from the center of people power. So they were leaning away from that power. So anyway, Gustavus Adolphus was the king of Sweden who fought the 30 Years' War for the Lutherans against the Catholics. Their general was General Tilly. 30 Years' War is a terrible war. Half the people were killed and towns were reduced to rubble before it was finally stopped by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So there's other things. So many things could be said here, but just trying to give you any other question?
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.